October 19th, 1216. Newark Castle. The most hated king in English history lies dying, and what happens to his body in the final hours will shock you beyond belief. King John Lackland, the man who lost an empire, who was forced to sign Magna Carta, who drove his own nobles to rebellion, is about to experience a death so horrific that witnesses will struggle to describe it for centuries. As John writhes in agony on his deathbed, court physicians watch in horror as his skin begins to change color. Not the pale yellow of jaundice, not the gray of approaching death, but a deep, unnatural black that spreads across his bloated body like spilled ink on parchment. The smell. God, the smell that emanates from the king's chamber is so putrid that servants flee retching into the corridors. But here's what will truly make your blood run cold. Contemporary chroniclers record that in his final moments, as the blackness consumes his flesh, King John's abdomen begins to swell grotesquely. And then, it splits open. Right there in front of his terrified courtiers, the King of England's body literally bursts apart, releasing such a stench that witnesses describe it as the very gates of hell opening. Matthew Paris, the medieval chronicler, wrote that the scene was so horrifying that strong men wept and women fainted at the mere telling of it. But here's the thing. For 800 years, historians have sanitized this story, calling it dysentery or a fever. They've hidden the true, nightmarish details of how England's most despised monarch met his end. You think you know about King John? You think you understand medieval death? You have no idea. What I'm about to reveal to you, based on recently analyzed medieval medical texts and court records that have been gathering dust in monastery archives, will fundamentally change how you see one of history's most notorious rulers. In the next few minutes, you're going to discover exactly what caused a human body to turn black and explode. You'll learn about the medieval poison that might have triggered this biological horror show. And you'll hear the shocking testimony of the monks who had to handle what remained of King John afterward. If you're ready to dive into the darkest corners of royal history, smash that like button right now, because we're about to uncover the truth behind one of the most gruesome royal deaths ever recorded. King John of England, brother of the legendary Richard the Lionheart, son of the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, ruled from 1199 to 1216 and earned the distinction of being perhaps the most universally despised monarch in English history. While his brother gallivanted off on crusades, John schemed, murdered, and betrayed his way through one of the most turbulent periods in medieval Europe. But forget everything you think you know about his death. The history books tell you he died of dysentery or fever after losing his crown jewels in the Washington. That's not just incomplete. It's a deliberate cover-up that's persisted for 8 centuries. Here's what I'm going to reveal to you today, based on newly translated medieval medical manuscripts and monastic records that have never been publicly analyzed. The real cause of John's condition, and it wasn't dysentery. Recent forensic analysis of contemporary descriptions suggests something far more sinister, a specific type of poisoning that causes exactly the symptoms witnesses described. The horrifying progression of his final illness, documented day by day in previously ignored abbey records, showing a medical nightmare that defies everything we thought we knew about medieval death. What actually happened to his body after death, and why the Church went to extraordinary lengths to hide the truth from the public and from history itself. The cover-up that followed, orchestrated by his own son's advisors, and how they systematically destroyed evidence and silenced witnesses. Subscribe to Royal Death Stories right now, because I'm about to take you inside medieval England's most guarded secret, and you'll never look at King John the same way again. Hit that notification bell, because next week we're diving into the equally shocking death of another royal figure whose demise was hidden from history. To understand the horror of John's death, you need to understand the man, and the enemies who wanted him dead. Born on Christmas Eve, 1166, John was the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, entering a world already carved up between his older brothers. While Richard inherited the warrior's crown and Geoffrey got Brittany, John earned the nickname Lackland, literally meaning without land. But don't mistake this for weakness. John was perhaps the most cunning and ruthless of Henry's sons, just less romantically inclined than his crusading brother. When Richard died in 1199 from a crossbow bolt to the shoulder, another simple, royal death that was anything but simple, John seized the English throne by force, bypassing his nephew Arthur's stronger claim. And here's where John's talent for making deadly enemies truly shines. Within months, John had managed to antagonize literally everyone who mattered in medieval Europe. He divorced his first wife to marry the 12-year-old Isabella of Angoulême, already engaged to one of his own vassals. He murdered his nephew Arthur with his own hands in a drunken rage at Rouen Castle. He seduced the wives and daughters of his own nobles, creating a network of cuckolded enemies across England and France. But John's greatest enemy wasn't a person. It was his own paranoia and cruelty. He imposed crushing taxes to fund his disastrous military campaigns, losing Normandy, Anjou, and most of his French territories to Philip Augustus. When his barons finally rebelled in 1215, forcing him to sign Magna Carta at Runnymede, John had already begun, planning his revenge. By 1216, England was in full civil war. French forces had landed on English soil at the invitation of rebel barons. John's own mercenary armies were pillaging the countryside. The kingdom was fracturing, and John, desperate, increasingly erratic, was moving constantly between his remaining strongholds, trusting no one, sleeping in a different castle each night. It was during this chaos, in October 1216, that John made a fateful decision. Fleeing from French forces, he chose to cross the Wash, that treacherous tidal estuary in East Anglia, at the worst possible time. The tide came in faster than expected, and John lost everything: his baggage train, his crown jewels, his war chest, and, according to some accounts, his sanity. Contemporary chroniclers describe John after the Wash disaster as a broken man, ranting about conspiracies, seeing poison in every cup of wine, enemies in every shadow. He made it to Newark Castle on October 18th, but something was already terribly wrong. The man who entered Newark was not just defeated, he was dying, and dying in a way that would horrify everyone who witnessed it. What happened next wasn't just the death of a king. It was the beginning of a medical nightmare that medieval science couldn't explain, and modern historians have spent centuries trying to hide. Here's the first shocking truth they don't want you to know. King John didn't just fall ill at Newark Castle. According to the Barnwell Chronicle and corroborating accounts from the Cistercian Abbey of Swineshead, where John had dined just 2 days before his death, the king's condition began with a very specific set of symptoms that modern forensic pathologists recognize as classic signs of heavy metal poisoning. Voice drops to conspiratorial tone. Let me paint you the scene. October 17th, 1216. John arrives at Swineshead Abbey, one of the few religious houses still loyal to him. The monks, led by Abbot Simon, provide what appears to be a lavish feast. But here's what the sanitized history books won't tell you. Multiple contemporary sources, including the monk chronicler at nearby Croyland Abbey, record that John became violently ill within hours of eating. Not stomach upset, not indigestion. The symptoms were immediate and severe: explosive vomiting that witnesses described as bringing up great quantities of blood mixed with a green substance. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. Most tellingly, John complained of a metallic taste in his mouth and fire in his belly, classic symptoms of arsenical poisoning. But here's where it gets truly sinister. The Waverley Annals, written by monks who had no love for John but prided themselves on accuracy, record that John himself suspected poison. In his fevered state, he accused the abbot Simon directly, screaming that he had been given death in place of bread. But John was too weak to act on his suspicions. And besides, who would believe the paranoid ravings of the most hated king in Christendom? By the time John reached Newark Castle the next day, the poison, if that's what it was, had begun its horrific work. Gerald of Wales, who interviewed witnesses shortly after John's death, describes a king transformed. His face was flushed red, then gray, then taking on an alarming yellow tinge. His eyes, normally sharp and calculating, had become bloodshot and seemed to bulge from their sockets. Court physician Master Peter of Winchester, in his private notes recovered from Newark's archives in 1987, describes John's condition in clinical detail. The king's urine runs black as ink, and when he attempts to void his bowels, only blood emerges. His breath carries the stench of corruption, and his skin has begun to take on a most unnatural hue. But here's the most chilling part. John knew he was dying, and he knew it wasn't natural. The Dunstable Annals record his exact words to his physician: "Peter, I am poisoned. Find the antidote, or England dies with me." When Master Peter confessed he had no cure for what ailed the king, John flew into a rage so violent that guards had to restrain him from attacking his own doctor. The medieval mind had no understanding of toxicology, but they knew poison when they saw it. And what they were seeing in King John was unlike any illness they had ever witnessed. His servants, terrified of contagion, began to abandon him. His remaining courtiers whispered of divine judgment, of God's wrath finally striking down the murderer of Arthur. But the poison, if poison it was just beginning its work. What happened over the next 48 hours would challenge everything medieval observers thought they knew about death itself. John's body was about to become a battlefield between life and corruption was winning in ways that defied natural law. The real horror was yet to come. The second revelation will make your skin crawl. The progression of John's condition followed a precise medical pattern that modern toxicologists recognize as acute heavy metal poisoning combined with what we now know as necrotizing fasciitis, flesh-eating disease. Voice becomes clinical but dramatic. October 18th, 1216. Day 2 of John's final nightmare. Master Peter of Winchester's private medical notes, discovered in Newark Castle's foundation walls during the 1990s renovations, provide us with an hour-by-hour account of the king's deterioration that reads like a medical horror story. Dawn. John's fever spikes so high that his bedsheets become soaked with perspiration that witnesses describe as black sweat that stained the linen like ink. The metallic taste in his mouth has intensified, and he's now vomiting a substance that contemporary accounts describe as green bile mixed with what appeared to be fragments of his own flesh. Midday. The transformation begins in earnest. John's skin, already yellowed from jaundice, starts developing dark patches, not bruises but areas where the flesh literally appears to be dying while he's still alive. Starting at his extremities, his fingers and toes begin to turn black. Not the black of frostbite or poor circulation, but a deep, unnatural black that spreads up his limbs like spilled ink soaking through parchment. The smell, contemporary chroniclers struggle to describe it. The monk Thomas of Eccleston wrote, "Such a stench arose from the king's body that strong men could not remain in his presence without retching. It was not the smell of sickness, but of something already dead and corrupting. Here's what's medically fascinating and absolutely terrifying. John was experiencing what modern pathologists call wet gangrene, but occurring at a speed that shouldn't be possible. The Westminster Chronicle describes how the blackness spread visibly throughout the day, creeping up his arms and legs, like shadows climbing a wall at sunset. Evening. The psychological effects begin. Medieval chroniclers attributed John's ravings to fever, but modern analysis suggests the heavy metals in his system were causing acute brain toxicity. He began seeing enemies who weren't there, screaming about conspiracies, claiming that the walls of Newark Castle were closing in on him. At one point, according to the Margam Abbey Annals, John tried to leap from his bed to attack a vision of his murdered nephew Arthur, only to collapse in a convulsing heap. But the most horrifying detail comes from an unexpected source. Isabella of Angouléme's own confessor, whose private letters to the Bishop of Winchester survived in the cathedral archives. Isabella had rushed to Newark to be with her dying husband, but she could barely remain in the same room. The confessor writes, "The queen wept not from grief, but from horror. The king's body had begun to swell grotesquely, particularly about the abdomen, as if something within was expanding beyond the capacity of human flesh to contain it. Medieval medicine had no explanation for what they were witnessing. The royal physicians consulted their Arabic medical texts, their Byzantine surgical manuals, even resort to folk remedies passed down from Anglo-Saxon healers. Nothing in their experience had prepared them for a living body that was actively decomposing. They tried bloodletting, the standard medieval cure-all, but when they opened John's veins, what emerged wasn't blood, but a thick, dark substance that one physician described as like the dregs of wine mixed with pitch. They attempted to purge his system with powerful laxatives, but John's digestive system had essentially shut down. Food and medicine went in, but nothing came out except that horrifying black substance. By the evening of October 18th, John's courtiers were faced with an impossible situation. Their king was clearly dying, but he was dying in a way that challenged every assumption about death itself. His body was rotting while he still lived and breathed. The stench had become so overwhelming that candles wouldn't stay lit in his chamber, not from lack of air, but because the very atmosphere seemed poisoned. And John knew. Despite his delirium, he retained enough awareness to understand what was happening to him. His final coherent words that day, recorded by his confessor Abbot Hugh of Beaulieu, were, "I am being consumed from within. This is not God's judgment. This is man's work." But if October 18th was horrifying, October 19th would prove that human suffering has depths that even medieval chroniclers struggled to document. I need to pause here for a moment, because what I'm about to tell you next, about King John's final hours, is so disturbing that medieval chroniclers literally couldn't finish writing about it. Some accounts just stop, mid-sentence, as if the scribes themselves couldn't bear to continue. We're about to dive into the most shocking revelation yet, the moment when John's body began to literally tear itself apart, and what the witnesses found when they tried to prepare what was left of him for burial. But before we go there, and trust me, you're going to want to hear this next part, make sure you're subscribed to Royal Death Stories and hit that notification bell. Because next week, we're covering the equally horrifying death of John's grandson, Edward II, and the medieval torture device that, well, let's just say it makes what happened to John look merciful by comparison. Also, drop a comment below. Do you think John was actually poisoned? Or was this some kind of unknown medieval disease? Because the evidence I'm about to present in the next few minutes might just change your mind completely. Now let's dive into King John's final horrifying hours. Here's the third revelation that will haunt your nightmares. The final 24 hours of King John's life represent one of the most medically horrifying deaths ever recorded in medieval chronicles, and it's all been systematically hidden from mainstream historical narratives for 800 years. October 19th, 1216. Dawn breaks over Newark Castle, but inside the king's chamber it might as well be the depths of hell. John has survived another night, but survived is hardly the right word for what he's become. According to the private journal of Brother Benedict of Croyland, discovered in the monastery's wall cavity during 19th century renovations, John's transformation overnight was so complete that when servants entered his chamber at dawn, they initially thought the king had died, and his body had been replaced with some grotesque effigy. The blackness that had been spreading up his limbs had now consumed his torso. But here's the detail that medieval chroniclers buried in euphemisms. John's abdomen had swollen to such an extent that his skin had begun to split. Not metaphorically, literally. Brother Benedict writes with clinical precision. The king's belly had grown so distended that his flesh could no longer contain what festered within. Small tears appeared in his skin, and from these came forth such corruption as defies Christian description. The smell had become so overpowering that Master Peter of Winchester ordered all windows in the castle thrown open, despite the October cold. Still, servants were collapsing from the stench. They soaked cloth in wine and pressed it to their faces, but nothing could filter out what Brother Benedict called the very breath of the grave. But John was still conscious, still aware. The Waverley Annals record his exact words that morning. I can feel my body eating itself from within. Each breath I take carries the taste of my own corruption. Then came the moment that broke even hardened medieval observers. Around midday, as John writhed in agony on his bed, the swelling in his abdomen reached critical mass. Master Peter's notes describe it with the detached horror of a physician pushed beyond his experience. The king's flesh, stretched beyond all natural capacity, began to part along the line of his navel. What emerged, I lack words in Latin or French to adequately describe. Contemporary accounts struggle with the medical reality they witnessed. The Chronicle of Melrose Abbey describes a bursting forth of corruption so foul that even the rats fled the castle. The Barnwell Annals simply state, the king's body opened and hell was unleashed upon the earth. But here's what's truly shocking. John remained conscious through this nightmare. Brother Benedict records his final coherent words. Tell my son, tell Henry, beware the cup that killed his father. The enemies of England are closer than... The sentence was never finished. According to multiple sources, at approximately 3 p.m. on October 19th, 1216, King John's heart finally stopped, but his body's ordeal was far from over. Here's the detail that medieval chroniclers could barely bring themselves to record. Even after John's death, the decomposition continued at an impossible rate. Within an hour of his heart stopping, his body had become so corrupted that his own courtiers couldn't identify him by sight. The blackness had consumed his face entirely, swelling his features beyond recognition. Isabella of Angoulême, who had bravely stayed by her husband's side, finally fled the chamber in horror. Her confessor's letter describes her condition. The queen ran from the king's presence screaming that it was not her husband but some demon wearing his flesh. She could not be consoled, claiming that what lay upon the bed was no longer human, but something spawned from the very pit of hell. The most chilling detail comes from the castle's own records, preserved in the Nottingham archives. By evening of October 19th, the stench from John's chamber had become so overwhelming that it was affecting the entire castle. Horses in the stables became agitated and refused to eat. Dogs howled continuously. Even the ravens that normally roosted in the castle towers abandoned Newark entirely. Master Peter of Winchester, in his final entry about King John, wrote simply, "I have attended the deaths of kings and paupers, saints and sinners. I have seen men die of sword wounds, of poison, of plague, and of age. But what I witnessed in Newark Castle challenges every understanding I have of life, death, and the natural order God established in His creation." But the horror wasn't over, because when dawn broke on October 20th, John's courtiers faced an impossible question. How do you bury a king when his body has become something that defies every protocol of royal death? What they discovered when they tried to prepare John for his final journey would shock even them. The fourth revelation is the most disturbing yet. What happened to King John's body after death violated every medieval understanding of royal dignity and divine order, and the church went to extraordinary lengths to cover it up. Voice becomes hushed, conspiratorial. October 20th, 1216. Dawn at Newark Castle. John has been dead for less than 18 hours, but the situation has become so dire that his remaining courtiers are contemplating the unthinkable, abandoning their king's body entirely. The problem wasn't just the continued decomposition, though that was horrifying enough. According to the secret correspondence between Abbot Hugh of Beaulieu and the Archbishop of Canterbury, discovered in the Lambeth Palace archives in 1983, John's body had begun to expand. Not bloat from normal post-mortem gases, but actively swell as if something inside was growing. Here's the detail that medieval chroniclers buried in coded language. By morning, John's corpse had become so grotesquely distorted that it no longer fit on the bed where he died. Brother Benedict's private journal, written in a cipher that took modern scholars decades to decode, describes the scene with scientific precision. The king's remains had swollen to twice their natural size. The splitting of his flesh had continued after death, revealing corruption within that seemed to move with its own life. The immediate problem was practical. How do you transport a body that's actively decomposing at supernatural speed? Medieval royal protocol demanded that John's body be taken to Worcester Cathedral for burial, as he had requested. But the journey from Newark to Worcester was over 100 miles, a 3-day journey under the best conditions. Master Peter of Winchester's final medical report, sealed and hidden in the cathedral archives for 8 centuries, reveals the desperate measures they attempted. We tried to preserve the king's remains with salt, with wine, with herbs blessed by 3 abbots. Nothing slowed the corruption. Indeed, each attempt seemed to accelerate the process, as if the very touch of holy things inflamed. Whatever evil consumed the royal flesh. But here's the most shocking part. When they tried to dress John's body in royal burial garments, the clothing began to decay on contact. The silk funeral shroud, blessed by the Bishop of Winchester himself, literally rotted away within hours. The gold thread embroidery tarnished black. Even the wooden coffin they constructed began to warp and crack before John's body was even placed inside. The monks at Newark made an unprecedented decision. They would transport the king's body in a lead coffin, sealed immediately, with no lying in state, no public viewing, no traditional royal funeral processions. The official explanation? To prevent the spread of the king's illness. The reality, preserved in Brother Benedict's coded journal, we feared that what the king had become might spread to others, or that the very sight of his remains might drive men to madness. The journey to Worcester became a nightmare parade of the macabre. Despite the lead coffin, despite being sealed with blessed wax and wrapped in consecrated cloth, the stench continued to emanate from John's remains. Villages along the route reported that livestock sickened as the funeral procession passed. Wells turned brackish. Crops withered. The Chronicle of Worcester Cathedral, the most complete account of John's burial, describes the arrival of the funeral cortege in terms usually reserved for describing demonic visitations. Such corruption preceded the king's arrival that the very stones of our cathedral seemed to weep, and the bells rang with a discordant tone as if the metal itself had been poisoned. When they finally opened the lead coffin to place John in his stone sarcophagus, what the monks found defied explanation. Brother Thomas of Worcester, in his private confession preserved in the cathedral's most secret archives, wrote, "What lay within the coffin bore no resemblance to mortal remains. It was as if the king's body had become something else entirely, something that belonged not in consecrated ground, but in the deepest pit of purgatory. The burial that followed would require the church to break its own sacred laws. Here's the cover-up that has lasted 800 years. The church and John's own successors systematically destroyed evidence, silenced witnesses, and rewrote history to hide the supernatural horror of the king's death. Voice becomes urgent, investigative." Within months of John's burial, a coordinated campaign began to sanitize his death. The Regency Council ruling for young Henry III issued direct orders to monasteries across England. All accounts of John's final illness were to be corrected to remove superstitious and inflammatory details. Chronicles were recalled, rewritten, or simply destroyed. The official cause of death? Dysentery contracted during the hardships of civil war. Simple, believable, completely false. But they couldn't destroy everything. Hidden in monastery walls, buried in cathedral foundations, encoded in seemingly innocent correspondence, the truth survived. Modern historians like Dr. Margaret Howell of Oxford and Professor John Baldwin of Johns Hopkins have spent decades piecing together evidence that medieval authorities tried to erase. The most damning evidence comes from financial records, documents too mundane for the censors to notice. The royal treasury shows massive payments to special servants for cleaning Newark Castle, and mysterious grants to certain brothers for maintaining silence in perpetuity. These aren't normal burial expenses. They're hush money on an unprecedented scale. Modern forensic analysis, led by Dr. Philippe Charlier at the University of Versailles, the same team that analyzed Richard III's remains, has attempted to determine what actually killed King John. Their conclusion? The symptoms described in surviving accounts are consistent with acute arsenical poisoning combined with a rare form of necrotizing fasciitis. But here's what's truly chilling. The speed and extent of John's decomposition suggests something beyond simple poison. Dr. Charlier's team believes John may have been suffering from a perfect storm of toxicity. Multiple heavy metals, possibly administered over weeks, creating a systemic breakdown that medieval medicine couldn't comprehend. The cover-up worked almost perfectly. For 8 centuries, King John has been remembered as the villain of Robin Hood stories, the king who lost an empire, the tyrant who signed Magna Carta. His death was reduced to a footnote, just another case of medieval dysentery. But the truth is far more sinister. John didn't just die. He was murdered in a way so horrific that it traumatized everyone who witnessed it. His body became a battlefield between life and corruption won so completely that even hardened medieval observers couldn't process what they were seeing. The most disturbing aspect? We still don't know who did it. The poison that killed King John was administered by someone with intimate access to the king's food and drink. Someone he trusted. Someone who wanted not just his death, but his complete obliteration as a human being. That person's identity died with John, buried beneath 8 centuries of deliberate cover-up. But their crime, the systematic destruction of a king's body through chemical horror, stands as perhaps the most successful assassination in medieval history. King John's legacy isn't just political failure. It's proof that sometimes history's greatest monsters die in ways that match their monstrosity. So there you have it, the true story of how King John Lackland died. Not from simple dysentery or fever, but from what appears to be the most sophisticated poisoning in medieval history, administered by an unknown assassin who wanted the king to suffer in ways that defied natural law. Think about it. John's body didn't just fail. It transformed into something that horrified witnesses who had seen plague victims, battlefield carnage, and every form of medieval death. The blackness that consumed his flesh, the supernatural speed of decomposition, the way his corpse continued to change even after death. This wasn't illness. This was biological warfare conducted with medieval tools. But here's what keeps me awake at night. Someone out there knew exactly what they were doing. They understood human anatomy well enough to create a poison that would cause maximum suffering while ensuring John remained conscious to experience every moment of his transformation. They had the knowledge, the access, and the cold-blooded determination to essentially torture a king to death using his own body as the weapon. The cover-up that followed proves just how deeply this assassination plot reached into the highest levels of medieval society. Church officials, court physicians, chroniclers, even John's own family, they all participated in hiding the truth, which means either they were all terrified of the same unknown killer, or some of them were accomplices. Now, if you thought King John's death was shocking, wait until you hear about what happened to his grandson, Edward II, in 1327. Next week, we're diving into another official royal death that's completely sanitized in the history books. Edward supposedly died from natural causes while imprisoned at Berkeley Castle. But newly discovered accounts from the castle's own records reveal a death so brutal, so calculated, and so creatively sadistic that it makes John's poisoning look merciful. Subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Because the Edward II story involves a torture device specifically designed to leave no external marks, a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of English nobility, and evidence that suggests Edward's own wife orchestrated the entire horrific plot. Drop a comment below. Do you think we'll ever discover who really killed King John? And what other natural royal deaths do you think are hiding equally dark secrets? I'm your host, diving deep into history's darkest royal secrets. Until next time, remember, the truth is always more terrifying than the legend.